Hello. I saw a Reddit post from the Silent Hill subreddit reposted onto Twitter by someone I'm sure many people in the Silent Hill fandom are familiar with. Hi, how you doing? Love your work. And the post was interesting to say the least. It felt like a 14-year-old's first little foray into symbolism and media analysis. But it got me thinking, and so I had to sit down and talk about it. First things first, let's get the big important part out of the way, which is reading the post so you have context. The post is titled, Silent Hill 2 is a horror game for men and Silent Hill 3 is a horror game for women. Let me explain a little. Silent Hill 2 deals with the fear of not being able to protect your loved ones, Mary succumbing to sickness while James can only watch her deteriorate. At the same time, the pressure of having to be a protecting figure to women and putting yourself in danger. Maria yells at you on various occasions for leaving her alone. Even in the beginning of the game, James is trying to mind his own business when Maria tells him that he has to protect her from the monsters because he's supposed to. Sexual frustration of not being able to intimidate and lusting for other women, and the guilt that comes with it. The fear of being trapped in James and Mary's relationship towards their final days. No man wants to be in James's place. Basically, the game touches on how a man is supposed to behave according to society's standards with the pressure and anxiety that it may involve. Silent Hill 3 deals with stalking, which is a pretty common fear on women. The objectification of women. Pretty much every character in the game is using Heather in one way or another. Douglas wants to atone for helping the cult find Heather, the cult wants to use her to birth a god, Harry saw her as a replacement for his lost daughter, etc. Heavy use of blood in the game's imagery, alluding to period, and the transition from child to woman. The fear of unwanted pregnancy and abortions, stuff like body dysmorphia, since beauty standards are something present and reminded to all women. Again, I'm sure this guy meant nothing by it. But I'm gonna read my favorite roast from Twitter real quick before I move on to the point I'm gonna make, just because I think we all deserve a good group laugh. Now I want to say I'm laughing with this guy, not at him. These are just some of my favorite tweet replies. No man wants to be in James's place, whereas every woman in non-binary evidently does. The masculine urge to flee a dying spouse. Silent Hill 2, a game where James is just minding his own business. Heavy use of blood in the game's imagery, as opposed to the other Silent Hill games, which only use a tasteful, moderate amount of blood. Silent Hill 3 is for women because the first main place you're in is the mall, and girls be shopping. Okay, we're done laughing. We're done. No more laughter. Now we're talking about serious stuff. Like Silent Hill. I think this post was a great stepping stone to something I've actually wanted to talk about in regards to Silent Hill for a hot minute. When my friends are kind enough to let my autistic ass talk about my special interests to them, and they let me do the whole 2-hour-long Silent Hill spiel I have constantly on repeat in my head, then this is some of the points I touch on. But I now get to word it in a way that makes sense to random strangers online, and I get to kind of explain it. Silent Hill 2 is not a horror game for men. It's a horror game about men. And Silent Hill 3 is not a horror game for women. It's a horror game about women. I am going to be explaining this with the assumption you know at least enough about Silent Hill to where I don't have to baby you through this whole discussion. I'm not going to assume you're like twin perfect pilled, but I'm going to assume you have enough knowledge about the series to where I don't have to explain who characters are. And just for the record, most of my discussion is going to focus on the first 4 games. Do I even have to elaborate on that? The first thing you need to understand when I'm talking about my perspective on this is that I have lived as both a woman and a man. I was born a lady and lived as a lady for 19 strong, wonderful years, and now I live my life full-time as a man. I work as a man, I exist as a man, I live my life as a man, I've had surgery to become a man. What this means is that I have experienced both sides of the gender coin, and so I would like to say my perspective is nuanced, to say the least. Now that we've gotten the outing myself out of the way, quick disclaimer moment. I'm not here for Silent Hill discourse. Silent Hill is full of some very judgmental fans and pretentious fans. I am not excluding myself from that. I'm saying I'm speaking from experience, dog. So just be gentle to me in my comments if you don't agree with me. You're fine to not agree with me. At least be nice about it. We're not animals here. Anyway, as I was saying, the first thing that I want to bring up into this discussion is how I personally believe a lot of people look at the Silent Hill monsters incorrectly. At least your casual fan looks at them incorrectly. In the first 4 games, we're all aware of these creatures from the other world, summoned by a spiritual power that has tainted the town of Silent Hill.
It's being invaded by the other world, by a world of someone's nightmarish delusions come to life.
In the first game, we have Alessa constantly combating this nightmare as Harry Mason runs through it, and these nightmares that are brought are Alessa's nightmares that are being induced by the fact that she's kind of acting as the bridge between the god and the real world. In Silent Hill 3, very similar situation due to the fact that Heather Mason is now acting as that bridge. In Silent Hill 2, we have monsters that seem to be specifically geared towards various people as they deal with their issues in this funky little lake town. In Silent Hill 4, every single monster is brought forth by Walter Sullivan doing the sacraments. It's very easy to look at these monsters and say that they are the protag's trauma monsters. This is what every sequel has kind of worked its way off of. Looking at you, Downpour and Homecoming. These monsters are apparently, to most people, supposed to represent the trauma of the person who's protagging the game. In my humble interpretation, I think these monsters are better suited to be called representations of the antagonist or representation of the trauma causers, and not necessarily representations of the trauma or dark thoughts themselves. Basically what I'm saying is all the monsters are the bad guys' faults. None of the monsters are actually the protags. In Silent Hill 1, these monsters are manifestations of Alessa's torture and pain caused by the cult. Same thing in Silent Hill 3. This fear, this anxiety, and these monsters that associate it with that Heather is experiencing are all caused by the cult. I would not call these Alessa or Heather's monsters. I would call them the cults, because the cult is causing these things to exist. In Silent Hill 2, James is the bad guy. He might be your protag, but he's not a hero in any way, shape, or form. These monsters come from him and represent him because he is the trauma-causing force. He caused the trauma. He killed his wife. This also applies when you look at, for example, Angela. Her monsters are not caused by her. Her monsters are caused by her father. In Silent Hill 2, the only monster of Angela's we see is a literal representation of her father abusing her. This monster is caused by him, quite literally. We don't get a peek at Eddie's monsters, but we do get a peek at Eddie's experience in Silent Hill 2, and it seems like those also represent his specific antagonizing point of view. Eddie nowadays, I would closely associate him with incels or online communities that specifically encourage toxic masculinity and male anger and the violence that comes from that, and his world seems to represent his antagonizing actions on the world. And then in Silent Hill 4, this is extremely obvious, and I don't even have to explain it. These monsters are literally Walter Sullivan's, because Walter Sullivan is literally killing people, and he is causing that trauma, and these monsters are representations of him doing that. Literally all the ghosts are his victims. I'm dumbing this down a lot because I don't want to spend time editing a 3-hour video today. That's just not where my head is at. So I hope you get what I'm saying. I'm simplifying it. When you look at the monsters like that, the interpretation that Silent Hill 2 is a game for men kind of falls apart because all the monsters are representations of male violence against women, not male power fantasies, and not being reminded that men have to protect and men have to love, and men, when they fail to protect, what happens? What happens is apparently they kill people. Specifically in his post, he references the pressure of being a protecting figure to women and putting yourself in danger, and then the fear of being trapped in Mary and James' relationship towards their final days. I think he's very close to getting it, but I think he's not breaking that final barrier. The experience of James is not from the pressure of protecting, it's not wanting to. He kills his wife. Like, he does, and it's not to put her out of her misery. It's not. That's literally, the game deconstructs his martyr complex that he has invented and falsified in his brain, and makes him confront the fact that he sucks and killed his wife. And the reason that this makes this a horror game about men is how it relates to the real world. According to the National Library of Medicine in 2009, the gender disparity in the rate of partner abandonment in patients with serious illness weighs heavily in men walking away from their wives. 1/4 of couples that experience a serious diagnosis against the female partner end in divorce. It is proven that women stick by their partners more than likely when they are diagnosed or going through serious illness and transitional periods with their health. Men tend to bounce. They don't only tend to bounce, though, they often tend to, when they don't think bouncing is an option, to do things much worse. According to the United Nations Office on Drug and Crime, in 2020, an estimated 47,000 women and girls across the globe were murdered by family members. This means, on average, in the year 2020, a woman or girl was murdered by her family member every 11 minutes. While a significant section of these cases were domestic abuse cases, i.e. husband to wife, many of them are also tied to specific causes of this domestic abuse, such as pregnancy or illness. Homicide is the leading cause of death for pregnant women in the United States. This seems to also be an international epidemic. Men killing their wives because they don't want to take care of them is not a special moment for men to feel like they failed protecting their wives. It's a moment for men to feel guilty because they kill their wives. Silent Hill 2 goes into detail about how much men perpetuate violence against women, both physically and sexually. The Reddit post specifically says that the game touches on how a man is supposed to behave according to society's standards, with the pressure and anxiety that it might involve, but not in the way that he thinks. Not in the way he thinks. This is emphasized also by Eddie, like I said before, and the portrayal of Angela's father, as I said before. Every male figure we meet in this game is awful. Is horrible to the women and girls in his life, and the whole game speaks on the violence that men perpetuate against women. You could argue this is a horror game for men because it hopefully will teach men not to act like this. The way this Reddit post is written, that's not why he thinks it's a game for men. He thinks it's a game for men because he relates to it, which is interesting. This is a fictional medium, so you relating to James or vibing with James or thinking James is hot or sympathizing with James doesn't make you a bad person. This post obviously shows he is not understanding of what James is supposed to represent. Much like Pyramid Head represents James's shame and guilt, James represents the worst of the male gender. Now, how does this relate to Silent Hill 3 being a horror game about women? You just spent the first half of this video, Eden, ragging on the concept of men. What, now women are awful too? Yes, everyone is awful. Everyone has the potential to be awful. In Silent Hill 3, you will notice that our main antagonist is not a man. It's a woman. Her name is Claudia. I think she's kind of milfy. That's not the point, though. The point is that this is a female versus female story. You are playing as a woman, fighting against a woman. What does that mean? Considering that a majority of the game involves the concept of forced birth, I think it's important to look at a few real-world statistics from the most recent years. In this article from November 5th, 2022 in The Guardian, Arwa Madabi writes, "White women have been voting against their reproductive interests for years." The journal found that white suburban women now favor Republicans for Congress by 15 percentage points, moving 27 percentage points away from Democrats since the poll only 3 months prior. White women have historically turned on other races and presentations of women. Politically, white women are extremely dangerous towards many minorities. To give a US-based example of this, in the 2016 presidential race, Hillary Clinton was backed by 54% of women. Donald Trump was backed by 39% of women. A majority of the women that voted for Hillary Clinton were not white, and a majority of the women that voted for Donald Trump were white. This same disparity continued on to the 2020 election in Biden versus Trump, with Trump once again gaining a majority vote for the white women of the United States. When it comes to politics, typically race will always outwin gender. Race will always outwin sexuality, and that means a lot of women, white women, act against their own interests in order to hold on to their white privilege and power. A vote for Trump was a vote against their reproductive rights and a vote against their physical safety, but it was still a vote against Black people even more. And now with the anti-trans wave we see flourishing in white supremacist cis female groups, it's hard to ignore that women perpetuate a large amount of violence against women in the name of patriarchy and in the name of white supremacy. Claudia, acting as this representation of a forced birther religious conservative against what looks like a more alternative-looking teenager, it's hard to ignore that in today's modern climate. Do I think that this was the mindset of the team making Silent Hill 3 20 years ago? I don't know. I don't believe so. But media stays the same while the world continues to grow around it, which means the interpretation of the media can change as the world we live in grows and changes. I am 100% sure that those books that I was forced to read in my freshman year English class that were published 200 years ago, I highly doubt I am analyzing them and writing papers on them the exact same way that people were doing 200 years ago. It also should not be ignored that once again Claudia is a religious figure doing all of this in the name of God. There are a million other people that can speak on this better than I can, mainly because I don't have the heart to. I have experienced a lot of this inner church abuse myself and inner religious abuse myself, so it's hard for me to talk about. But women are some of the greatest enablers in Christian churches and with what they do to women and youth. This includes what they do with people's birthing rights. When I see people like Claudia out in the real world, I think of articles that you might know because they're quite famous now, such as The Only Moral Abortion is My Abortion by Joyce Arthur. I also think the way Claudia is treated by other people within her church also speaks a lot to the white women in politics syndrome I'm talking about.
You hated your father, didn't you? I saw the way he hit you, kicked you, and made you cry.
White women have enough oppression to definitely deal with what I would call baseline patriarchy and baseline misogynistic abuse. I'm not saying white women are free from patriarchal oppression, you know what I mean? What I am saying is that whiteness typically finds its way above womanhood. Historically, Black women have not even been treated as people. If you look at a lot of historical documents, Black women are often called not real women and animals more than they are considered female and women. Black trans women are the #1 murder demographic by percentage in the US, and white women perpetuate that. They really do. And so when I see the imagery in Silent Hill 3, and I see a religious woman going out of her way to try to make a teenager give forced birth, with all of the horrifying monsters that are being encouraged by Claudia's trauma making, then it reminds me of the fear I felt living as a woman, seeing women not protect me. I come from a family of immigrants, and when I was a teenager, I was also very openly queer, and I had my back turned on me by many, many, many white women. And so did all of my friends. And Claudia's attitude resonates. That's what makes her scary. I think it's interesting that the poster on Reddit, I think he was correct about the fear of unwanted pregnancy and abortions. I don't think he also was looking at the greater context of why. But there is one idea in his Silent Hill 3 thing I want to talk about a little bit further, which is the excess of blood to represent a period as the transition between child to woman. The concept of getting your period making you a full-grown woman, no longer a young girl, no longer a preteen girl, no longer a teenage girl, but woman, is so rooted in religious misogyny that it's insane. And women like Claudia uphold that. I do have to say, it is so fucking funny. I'm sorry, like, I know I said we were done roasting the fuck out of this guy, but you have to admit, it is so funny that he saw a female protagonist and saw some blood in a horror game and said that must be her period. It has to be. I think the Silent Hill games are interesting because I do think a lot of it can be left up for interpretation, but certainly not all of it. Silent Hill is actually one of the few horror games in the world that has, like, an ample amount of concrete answers, like in-text answers. But I think as the games age, the things that are going to keep being brought up for actual interpretation is the experience of the player based on their own identities and perceptions of the world. A lot has changed, like a lot has changed internationally since the creation of these games. 2 decades have gone by, multiple wars have gone by. The legalization of gay rights globally has shifted significantly, usually in a more positive light, sometimes not. The treatment of women has shifted, usually in a positive light, sometimes not. Societal norms are changing. The economy is all over the place. And the world is going to keep turning and moving. And so the way that people look at these, survival horror games is going to constantly kind of be updating itself in people's heads. That being said, I think any surface level media interpretation, especially based around gender, should be dealt with very carefully. I feel like a lot of men who look at games like this very surface level tend to fall into perpetuating more misogyny than they realize. The last little sentence on this guy's post is, "These are all the points I could find, but every time I replay the games, I can see that one game can be more effective in women and the other in men. I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on this subject." These were my thoughts.